The chandelier in the grand ballroom of the Whitmore estate cast its light across 300 faces, all dressed in silk and diamonds, all waiting for the moment that would change everything. Victoria Whitmore stood at the center of it all, her emerald gown shimmering like the scales of a serpent, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. She had planned this evening for months. Every detail had been orchestrated with surgical precision. The flowers imported from Holland. The champagne chilled to exactly 42 degrees. The guest list curated to include only the wealthiest families in the county, and one special invitation sent to a man who owned nothing but a rusted motorcycle and a leather vest covered in patches. His name was Samuel Briggs. He was 53 years old. He lived in a trailer at the edge of town, worked part-time at a garage, and spent his weekends volunteering at a veterans shelter. Victoria had seen him once, pumping gas at the station near her estate, his hands stained with grease, his boots worn thin. She had watched him help an elderly woman carry her groceries to her car. She had watched him refuse the $5 tip she tried to press into his palm. And in that moment, Victoria had felt something she rarely felt: irritation. Because kindness without ambition was something she could not understand. So she sent him an invitation. Gold lettering on cream-colored paper, a formal request to attend her annual charity gala. She told her friends it was an experiment in social observation. She told her husband it was a joke. But deep inside, Victoria Whitmore wanted to see a man like Samuel Briggs squirm beneath the weight of wealth he could never possess. She wanted to watch him realize that no amount of good deeds could buy him a seat at her table. What she did not know was that Samuel Briggs had sat at tables far more dangerous than hers. He had served 3 tours overseas. He had carried wounded brothers through smoke and fire. He had buried friends beneath flags and returned home to a country that had already forgotten their names. Samuel Briggs did not squirm. He did not shrink. He simply showed up. And when he walked through the doors of the Whitmore estate that evening, the entire room fell silent. He wore his cleanest jeans, a pressed white shirt beneath his leather vest. His boots had been polished for the first time in years. His beard was trimmed. His posture was straight. He carried himself not with arrogance, but with the quiet dignity of a man who had seen the worst of humanity and chosen to remain kind anyway. The guests stared. Some whispered. A few laughed behind their champagne flutes. But Samuel walked forward, his eyes scanning the room until they found Victoria. She was already watching him, her smile frozen, her heart beating faster than she expected. This was not how the story was supposed to go. He was supposed to look ashamed, intimidated, out of place. Instead, he looked at her the way a soldier looks at a battlefield: calm, aware, ready. Victoria stepped forward, her heels clicking against the marble floor. She extended her hand with practiced grace. "Welcome, Mr. Briggs. I am so pleased you could join us." Her voice was honey-coated in acid. Samuel took her hand gently, his grip firm but not aggressive. "Thank you for the invitation," he said. "It is not often that someone like me gets to see how the other half lives." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Victoria felt the first crack in her armor. The evening continued. Waiters circled with trays of appetizers that cost more than Samuel's monthly grocery budget. Guests exchanged pleasantries about vacation homes and stock portfolios. Samuel stood near the back of the room, watching, listening, sipping a glass of water because the champagne tasted too bitter. A young woman approached him. Her name was Clara. She was the daughter of a shipping magnate and had been dragged to the party by her mother. She had noticed Samuel the moment he walked in, not because of his clothes, but because of his stillness. In a room full of people trying desperately to be seen, Samuel Briggs seemed completely at peace with being invisible. "You do not look like you belong here," Clara said. It was not an insult. It was an observation. Samuel smiled. "That makes 2 of us," he replied. Clara laughed. It was the first genuine laugh she had released in months. They talked for nearly an hour. Samuel told her about his time in the service, about the brothers he had lost, about the shelter where he volunteered, helping veterans find housing and purpose. Clara listened, really listened, and for the first time in her life, she felt like she was standing next to someone real. Victoria watched from across the room. Her experiment was failing. Samuel was not being humiliated. He was making connections. He was earning respect. And that was something Victoria could not allow. She signaled to her husband, Richard, a man whose wealth had been inherited and whose spine had never been tested. Together, they approached Samuel with a plan that had been whispered between them for the past 30 minutes. Richard cleared his throat. "Mr. Briggs," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "my wife tells me you work at a garage. Tell me, what is it like to spend your days covered in oil while the rest of us build empires?" The question was designed to wound, to remind Samuel of his place. But Samuel did not flinch. He looked Richard in the eye and spoke slowly. "I have spent my days doing many things, Mr. Whitmore. I have fixed engines. I have carried stretchers. I have held the hands of dying men and promised them they would not be forgotten. Building empires is fine work, I suppose, but I have always preferred building people." The room had gone quiet, not because of the confrontation, but because of what happened next. A man in his 60s stepped forward from the crowd. His suit was tailored. His watch was worth more than most cars. His name was Harold Jennings, and he was one of the most powerful industrialists in the state. He walked directly toward Samuel and extended his hand. "Sergeant Briggs," he said, "I thought I recognized you." The two men shook hands like old friends reuniting after decades apart. Victoria's face went pale. Richard took a step back. The room watched in stunned silence as Harold Jennings placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder. "This man saved my son's life," Harold announced. His voice carried across the ballroom like thunder. 19 years ago, in a place none of you would want to visit, my son was wounded in an ambush. He would have died if not for Sergeant Samuel Briggs, who carried him 3 miles through hostile territory with bullets flying past his head. My son is alive today because of this man, and I will not stand here and watch him be disrespected by anyone." Victoria's world tilted. The laughter she had planned to share with her friends turned to ash in her throat. The humiliation she had intended for Samuel had landed squarely on her own shoulders. The guests began to murmur. Some approached Samuel to shake his hand. Others simply nodded in respect. Clara was crying quietly, her mascara running, her heart full of something she could not name. But the evening was far from over, because what no one knew, not even Harold Jennings, was that Samuel had not come to this party by accident. He had come because of a letter he had received 3 weeks earlier from a young woman named Emily. A letter that described a mother who cared more about appearances than love. A letter that begged for help from a world that did not listen. Emily was Victoria Whitmore's daughter. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel, because stories like this one, stories of courage and dignity and the quiet power of those who refuse to be broken, are what we share here every single day. If you believe that kindness is stronger than cruelty, then join us. Subscribe now and become part of a community that never looks away. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Samuel had been sitting on the porch of his trailer, drinking coffee and watching the sun dip behind the trees when the mail truck pulled up. Most of his mail was bills or advertisements, thin envelopes that carried weight far beyond their paper. But this envelope was different. It was handwritten. The return address was local but unfamiliar, and when Samuel opened it, he found 3 pages of neat cursive that told a story he had heard too many times before. Emily Whitmore was 22 years old. She had graduated from an Ivy League university with honors. She had traveled to Europe, learned 2 languages, and mastered the piano by age 14. On paper, her life was perfect. But paper lies. Because behind the gates of the Whitmore estate, Emily had grown up in a house without warmth. Her mother saw her as an accessory, a trophy to be displayed at social functions and hidden away when inconvenient. Her father was a ghost, present in body but absent in spirit, more concerned with investments than conversations. Emily had learned early that love was transactional in her family. It was earned through obedience and withdrawn through disappointment. She had tried to leave. Twice. The first time, her mother had threatened to cut her off entirely, to erase her from the will, to tell the world that Emily was unstable. The second time, Emily had made it as far as the bus station before a panic attack brought her to her knees. She returned home that night and locked herself in her room for 3 days. No one came to check on her. No one noticed she was gone. The letter to Samuel had been a last resort. Emily had seen him once, years ago, when she was volunteering at the same shelter where he worked. She had watched him talk to a homeless veteran, a man everyone else avoided with such patience and kindness that it made her chest ache. She had never spoken to him, but she remembered his name, and when she learned that her mother had invited him to the gala as a cruel joke, something inside her broke open. "Please," she had written, "I do not expect you to save me. I do not expect anyone to save me. But if you come to the party, maybe you can remind my mother that not everyone in the world operates by her rules. Maybe you can show her that dignity cannot be bought. Maybe, just maybe, you can give me the courage to finally walk away." Samuel had read the letter 4 times. He had folded it carefully and placed it in his Bible, next to a photograph of his late wife and a list of names he prayed for every night. He had not known what he would do at the party. He had not come with a plan. He had simply shown up, trusting that the right moment would reveal itself. And now, standing in the middle of the Whitmore ballroom with 300 eyes on him, Samuel understood what he needed to do. He excused himself from the crowd and walked toward the grand staircase. Victoria watched him go, her confusion mounting. Richard poured himself another drink. The guests returned to their conversations, still buzzing about the revelation of Samuel's heroism, but Clara followed him with her eyes. She sensed that the evening was not yet complete. Samuel climbed the stairs slowly, his boots silent on the carpeted steps. He passed portraits of Whitmore ancestors, stern faces staring down from gilded frames, and arrived at a hallway lined with closed doors. He did not know which room belonged to Emily, but he trusted his instincts. He had spent years reading terrain, reading people, reading the invisible currents that flowed beneath the surface of things, and when he stopped in front of the third door on the left, he knew. He knocked softly. There was a pause, then a voice, quiet and fragile. "Who is it?" Samuel leaned closer to the door. "My name is Samuel Briggs," he said. "You wrote me a letter." The silence stretched for what felt like minutes. Then the door opened, just a crack, and Emily Whitmore looked out at the man who had answered her desperate call. She was thin, almost fragile, with dark circles beneath her eyes that no amount of concealer could hide. Her dress was expensive but wrinkled, as if she had been sitting in it for hours, unable to summon the energy to change. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the door. "You came," she whispered. Samuel nodded. "I came." Emily stepped back, allowing him to enter the room. It was large and beautifully decorated, but it felt cold, impersonal, like a hotel room that had never been lived in. Samuel noticed the suitcase in the corner, half packed. He noticed the bus ticket on the nightstand. He noticed the way Emily's eyes kept darting toward the window, as if calculating the distance to the ground. "I do not know what to do," Emily said. Her voice cracked. "I have tried so many times to leave, but every time I get close, something pulls me back. Fear. Guilt. The voice in my head that sounds exactly like my mother." She sat down on the edge of the bed, her shoulders curved inward. Samuel remained standing, giving her space, letting her words find their own rhythm. "Your mother invited me here to humiliate me," Samuel said gently. "She wanted to prove that people like me do not belong in her world." Emily nodded. "She does that. She finds people she considers beneath her and uses them for entertainment. It makes her feel powerful." Samuel moved closer, lowering himself into a chair across from her. "And what makes you feel powerful?" he asked. The question seemed to catch Emily off guard. She looked at him, really looked, and for a moment the walls she had built around herself began to crack. "I do not know," she admitted. "I have never been allowed to feel powerful. I have only been allowed to feel grateful. Grateful for the money. Grateful for the education. Grateful for the cage they built around me and called a life. Samuel leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. I spent 2 years in a prison camp, he said quietly. Emily's eyes widened. She had not known this. No one knew this except for a handful of people who had been there. The official records called it a detention facility, but it was a cage, just like yours. Different bars, same feeling. He continued. They tried to break me. They used pain. They used isolation. They used words that were sharper than any blade. And for a while, I thought they had won. I thought I would never see home again. I thought I would die in that place, forgotten and alone. Emily was crying now, silent tears streaming down her cheeks. Samuel's voice remained steady. But one day, I realized something. They could control my body. They could control my environment, but they could not control my mind unless I let them. I started making choices, small ones at first. I chose to exercise when they wanted me to be weak. I chose to pray when they wanted me to despair. I chose to remember the faces of the people who loved me when they wanted me to feel worthless. And slowly, choice by choice, I rebuilt myself from the inside out. He reached into his vest and pulled out a small object. It was a compass, old and scratched, with a cracked glass face. My father gave this to me before I enlisted, Samuel said. He told me that as long as I knew which direction I was heading, I could never truly be lost. I kept this compass with me through everything, through the war, through the camp, through the years of rebuilding. And tonight, I brought it with me because I had a feeling someone else might need it. He placed the compass in Emily's hand. She looked down at it, feeling its weight, tracing the letters etched into the metal. North, south, east, west. 4 directions, infinite possibilities. You wrote me a letter asking if I could give you courage, Samuel said. But courage is not something one person can give to another. It is something you find within yourself when you decide that the pain of staying is greater than the fear of leaving. I cannot tell you what to do. I cannot promise that leaving will be easy. But I can tell you this. The world outside those gates is vast and full of people who will love you for who you are, not for what you can give them. You deserve to find those people. You deserve to be free. Emily clutched the compass to her chest. The tears had stopped, replaced by something harder, something brighter. Resolution. I have been so afraid, she said. Afraid that I would fail. Afraid that I would end up alone. Afraid that my mother was right, that I am nothing without her money, her name, her approval. Samuel shook his head. Fear is not a sign of weakness. Fear is a sign that something matters to you. The question is whether you will let fear make your decisions, or whether you will make them yourself. Emily stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the estate grounds, the manicured lawns, the fountain lit up like a stage. She had lived here her entire life. She knew every corner, every shadow, every hiding place, and suddenly, all of it felt small. I want to leave, she said. Not tomorrow, not next week, tonight. Samuel nodded, then leave. Emily turned to face him. Will you help me? Samuel smiled, the kind of smile that comes from years of hard-won wisdom. I will walk you to the door, but the steps you take after that are yours alone. They descended the staircase together. The party was still in full swing, the guests oblivious to the transformation happening above their heads. Victoria was holding court near the bar, laughing at something Richard had said, pretending that the earlier confrontation had not rattled her. But when she saw her daughter walking toward the front door with the biker at her side, her laughter died. "Emily!" she called out. "Where do you think you are going?" The room went quiet again. Heads turned. Champagne glasses paused mid-sip. Emily stopped at the bottom of the stairs and faced her mother. "I am leaving," she said. Her voice was steady, clear. "I am leaving this house, this party, and this life you have tried to force on me." Victoria's face twisted with disbelief. "Do not be ridiculous. You cannot survive out there on your own. You have no skills, no experience, no idea how the real world works. Emily held up the compass. "Then I will learn," she said, "the way everyone else learns. One step at a time." Victoria stepped forward, her heels clicking like gunshots. "If you walk out that door, you are no longer my daughter. I will cut you off completely. You will have nothing." Emily looked at her mother for a long moment. She thought about all the years of silence, all the dinners where she was seen but not heard, all the times she had cried in her room while the party continued downstairs. And then she said something that would echo in Victoria Whitmore's mind for the rest of her life. "I already have nothing, Mother. I have lived in this house for 22 years, and I have never once felt loved. I have been fed and clothed and educated, but I have never been held. I have never been told that I matter. I have never been allowed to make a mistake without being reminded of it for months afterward. You gave me everything except the one thing I actually needed. And tonight, I am choosing to go find it myself." She turned and walked toward the door. Samuel followed a few steps behind, not as a protector but as a witness. The guests parted like water, creating a path to the exit. Clara was standing near the doorway, her eyes wide, her heart pounding. As Emily passed, Clara reached out and grabbed her hand. "Take me with you," Clara whispered. Emily looked at her, this stranger who had become an ally in a single evening. Together, the two young women walked out of the Whitmore estate and into the cool night air. Samuel stepped onto the porch and watched them go. Emily's suitcase was in the trunk of Clara's car within minutes. The engine started, the headlights cut through the darkness, and just like that, they were gone. Samuel stood alone on the porch, listening to the sound of the car fading into the distance. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to find Harold Jennings standing beside him. "You did a good thing tonight," Harold said. Samuel shook his head. "I did not do anything. She did it herself. I just reminded her that she could." Harold smiled. "That is the most powerful thing one person can do for another," he said. "Remind them of their own strength." The two men stood in silence for a moment, watching the stars emerge above the trees. Then Harold reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. "I run a foundation for veterans," he said. "Housing, job training, mental health support. We are always looking for people who understand what it means to serve. If you ever want to do more than volunteer, give me a call." Samuel took the card and looked at it. The letters were embossed in gold. The address was in the city, far from the dusty roads and trailer parks he called home. But something about the offer felt right, like a door opening onto a path he had not known existed. "I will think about it," Samuel said. Harold nodded. "Take your time. But remember, sometimes the best way to heal ourselves is to help others heal." Samuel tucked the card into his vest, next to the empty space where his compass used to be. He thought about Emily, driving through the night with a stranger who had become a friend, carrying a small piece of his history in her pocket. He thought about the men and women at the shelter, waiting for someone to remind them that they mattered. He thought about his wife, gone now for 7 years, who had always told him that his greatest gift was his ability to make people feel seen. Maybe it was time to use that gift on a larger scale. He walked back into the ballroom, not because he wanted to stay, but because he had one more thing to say. Victoria was standing by the fireplace, her face a mask of barely contained fury. Richard had retreated to a corner, clutching his drink like a lifeline. The guests were pretending to enjoy themselves, but the energy in the room had shifted. Something had changed, and everyone could feel it. Samuel approached Victoria directly. She stiffened, expecting another confrontation. But Samuel's voice was gentle when he spoke. "I know you invited me here to make yourself feel superior," he said, "and I understand why. When you have everything the world says you should want, and you still feel empty, it is easier to look down on others than to look inward. But I want you to know something, Mrs. Whitmore. Your daughter did not leave because of me. She left because she finally realized that she deserves to be loved, not managed. She deserves to be heard, not silenced. She deserves a life that is hers, not an extension of yours." Victoria's mask cracked. For a moment, just a moment, Samuel saw something beneath the surface. Pain, fear, the desperate loneliness of a woman who had spent her whole life building walls and had finally realized she was trapped inside them. "It is not too late," Samuel continued. "It is never too late to become the person you were meant to be. But it requires honesty. It requires humility. And it requires the courage to admit that money and status are not substitutes for love." He turned and walked away, leaving Victoria standing alone by the fireplace. The flames cast shadows across her face, dancing patterns of light and dark that seemed to mirror the conflict raging inside her. Richard approached, reaching for her hand, but she pulled away. "Not now," she said. "I need to think. If you are watching this story and feeling something stir in your heart, pause for a moment. Think about the people in your life who have shown you kindness when you least deserved it. Think about the times when someone reminded you of your own strength. And then leave a comment below with these words: dignity cannot be bought. Say it out loud if you need to. Write it where you can see it every day. Because in a world that often measures worth in dollars and status, we need constant reminders that the most valuable things in life are free. The weeks that followed the party were transformative for everyone involved. Emily and Clara found a small apartment in a neighboring city, a modest 2-bedroom with creaky floors and a view of a parking lot. It was nothing like the estate, nothing like the life Emily had known, and it was perfect. Clara got a job at a non-profit, using her family connections to open doors for causes that actually mattered. Emily enrolled in community college, studying social work, learning how to help others escape the cages that had once trapped her. They visited the veterans' shelter every Saturday. Emily wanted to understand what had made Samuel the man he was. She wanted to learn from the people who had served, the people who had sacrificed, the people who had lost everything and rebuilt themselves from scratch. And slowly, week by week, she began to find her own voice. Samuel accepted Harold Jennings's offer. He moved to the city and took a position at the foundation, overseeing outreach programs for homeless veterans. The work was hard, the hours were long, but for the first time in years, Samuel felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He missed his trailer sometimes, the quiet mornings and the sound of birds in the trees. But he had traded solitude for purpose, and the exchange felt right. He kept in touch with Emily. They met for coffee once a month, exchanging stories and advice. She showed him the compass every time they met, pulling it out of her pocket like a talisman. It had become her anchor, a reminder of the night she had chosen herself over fear. Samuel never asked for it back. Some gifts are meant to be given away. Richard Whitmore filed for divorce 3 months after the party. The official reason was irreconcilable differences, but the real reason was simpler. He had watched his daughter walk out the door and realized that he had been just as absent as his wife. He had chosen comfort over connection, wealth over warmth, and the choice had cost him everything. He moved to a smaller house on the coast and started volunteering at a local food bank. It was not redemption, not exactly, but it was a start. Victoria was the hardest to read. She did not reach out to Emily. She did not apologize. She did not change. At least, not in any visible way. But the staff at the Whitmore estate noticed small differences. She stopped hosting parties. She let the gardeners go home early. She spent long hours in the library, reading books she had never touched before. Philosophy, psychology, memoirs of people who had overcome adversity. No one knew what she was searching for. Perhaps she did not know herself. But one evening, 6 months after the party, a letter arrived at Emily's apartment. It was handwritten. The return address was the Whitmore estate. Emily recognized her mother's handwriting immediately, the precise loops and curves that had signed permission slips and birthday cards throughout her childhood. She held the envelope for a long time before opening it. The letter was short. It did not contain an apology. It did not contain an explanation. It contained only 3 sentences. "I have been thinking about what you said. I do not know how to change, but I want to learn." Emily read the letter twice. She folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. She did not know how to respond. She was not ready to forgive. But for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that forgiveness might be possible. Someday. when the wounds had healed enough to be touched. Samuel heard about the letter from Emily during one of their coffee meetings. He listened without judgment, nodding slowly as she described her conflicting emotions. "What should I do?" she asked. "Should I respond? Should I give her another chance?" Samuel took a sip of his coffee, considering the question carefully. "Forgiveness is not something you do for the other person," he said finally. "It is something you do for yourself. It does not mean forgetting. It does not mean pretending the hurt did not happen. It means releasing the weight of anger so you can move forward. Whether you respond to your mother's letter is your choice. But do not let fear or resentment make that choice for you. Let your heart decide." Emily nodded slowly. "My heart is still figuring things out," she admitted. Samuel smiled. "That is perfectly fine. Hearts take time. Just keep listening to yours, and it will tell you what to do." The foundation hosted a gala of its own that winter, a fundraiser for a new transitional housing program. Samuel was asked to speak. He had never been comfortable with public speaking, preferring action to words. But Harold convinced him that his story could inspire others, could show people that transformation was possible at any age, in any circumstance. The night of the gala, Samuel stood at the podium and looked out at the crowd. These were not the same faces he had seen at the Whitmore estate. These were veterans, social workers, donors who gave because they believed in the mission, not because they wanted to be seen. Samuel cleared his throat and began. "I spent most of my life thinking I was not worth much," he said. "I came from nothing. I did not finish college. I made mistakes that still keep me up at night. But I learned something important along the way. Worth is not determined by what you have. It is determined by what you give." He paused, letting the words settle. "I have been given a lot in my life. Brothers who fought beside me, a wife who loved me despite my flaws, a second chance when I thought my story was over. And now, I have been given the privilege of helping others find their own second chances. That is worth more than any amount of money. That is worth more than any title or position. That is the only kind of wealth that matters." The applause was thunderous. People rose to their feet, not because they were supposed to, but because they felt something genuine. Samuel looked down from the podium and saw Emily in the crowd, standing beside Clara, both of them clapping with tears in their eyes. He saw Harold Jennings nodding with pride. He saw strangers wiping their cheeks, moved by a story that was both unique and universal. After the speech, a woman approached Samuel. She was in her 60s, elegantly dressed with silver hair and kind eyes. She introduced herself as Margaret Holloway, the director of a national veterans organization. She had heard about Samuel's work and wanted to discuss a partnership. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, spanning topics from housing policy to mental health resources to the importance of community and recovery. By the end of the evening, Samuel had agreed to join the organization's advisory board. It was another step forward, another door opening onto a path he had never imagined. He thought about the rusted motorcycle still parked outside his old trailer, the leather vest that had marked him as an outsider in polished ballrooms. He thought about how far he had traveled, not in miles, but in purpose. Spring arrived with unexpected warmth. The trees along the city streets burst into bloom, scattering petals across sidewalks and park benches. Samuel walked through the neighborhood near the foundation headquarters, enjoying the simple pleasure of sunlight on his face. He had learned to appreciate these moments, the quiet spaces between obligations, the breaths of peace that made the hard work worthwhile. His phone buzzed with a message from Emily. She had made a decision. She was going to respond to her mother's letter. Not with forgiveness, not yet, but with an invitation, a lunch meeting at a neutral location, a chance to talk without the weight of the estate bearing down on them. She asked if Samuel would be willing to come along, not to mediate, but to be present. A reminder of the night everything changed. Samuel agreed without hesitation. The meeting took place at a small restaurant downtown, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and handwritten menus. Victoria arrived first, looking smaller than Samuel remembered. The months of solitude had softened her somehow, worn down the sharp edges that had defined her for so long. She sat alone at a corner table, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the door. When Emily walked in, Victoria stood. The two women faced each other across a distance that felt much greater than the few feet between them. Samuel stayed near the entrance, giving them space, ready to intervene if needed, but hoping it would not be necessary. "You came," Victoria said. Her voice was quieter than Samuel had ever heard it. Emily nodded. "I came." They sat down across from each other. The server brought water and menus, unaware of the significance of this moment. For several minutes, neither woman spoke. The silence was heavy, but it was not hostile. It was the silence of two people trying to find words for feelings that had been buried for decades. Finally, Victoria spoke. "I do not know how to apologize," she said. "I was never taught. My mother was the same way, and her mother before her. We show love through things, through opportunities, through control. It is the only language I know." Emily listened without interrupting. Victoria continued. "When you walked out that night, I told myself you were ungrateful. I told myself you would come crawling back within a week. I told myself that I had done nothing wrong." She paused, her voice breaking slightly. "But then the weeks passed, and the months, and you did not come back. And I realized that I had been lying to myself for longer than I can remember." Emily reached across the table and placed her hand on her mother's. It was not a gesture of forgiveness. It was a gesture of acknowledgement. "I needed to leave," Emily said. "Not because I hate you, because I needed to find out who I am without your expectations defining me. I needed to learn that I am valuable even when I am not performing for your approval." Victoria nodded, tears streaming down her face. She made no effort to hide them. "I know," she whispered. "I know." They talked for nearly 2 hours. They did not solve everything. They did not repair decades of damage in a single conversation. But they began. They laid the first bricks of a bridge that might, someday, span the chasm between them. And when they finally stood to leave, Victoria did something she had not done since Emily was a child. She pulled her daughter into an embrace and held her tight. Samuel watched from across the restaurant. He thought about all the journeys that had led to this moment. His own journey from soldier to survivor to servant. Emily's journey from captive to free. Even Victoria's journey from certainty to questioning. They were all connected, threads woven into a tapestry that none of them could see in full, but all of them could feel. He stepped outside into the spring air, leaving mother and daughter to their reunion. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the pavement, painting the world in shades of gold and amber. Samuel walked slowly, savoring each step, thinking about the strange and beautiful paths that life creates when we least expect them. His phone buzzed again. It was a message from Harold. The foundation had received a major donation, enough to fund the new housing program for the next 5 years. The donor wished to remain anonymous, but Harold suspected it was someone connected to the Whitmore family. Samuel smiled and tucked the phone back into his pocket. Some debts are paid with money. Others are paid with change. A year passed. Emily completed her first year of social work studies with honors. Clara was promoted to program director at the nonprofit. Victoria began seeing a therapist, working through patterns and wounds that stretched back generations. Richard sent Emily a birthday card with a handwritten note apologizing for his absence and promising to do better. The family was not healed, not completely, but they were healing, and that was enough. Samuel turned 54. The foundation threw him a small party, cake and coffee, and a room full of people whose lives he had touched. They gave him a plaque that read, "Service is not what you do. It is who you are." He hung it on the wall of his office next to the compass Harold had bought him to replace the one he had given away. Actually, that was not quite right. Harold had tried to buy him a new compass, but Samuel had declined. "Some things are not meant to be replaced," he explained. "They are meant to be passed on." And so the wall held only the plaque, and the empty space where a compass might have hung was a reminder of a gift that was still traveling, still guiding, still pointing toward true north. Emily called him on his birthday. She had news. She was engaged. Clara had proposed on the rooftop of their apartment building, under a sky full of stars, with a ring that cost exactly 1 month's salary. Emily had said yes before Clara finished the question. The wedding would be small, the guest list would be carefully chosen, and Samuel was invited, of course, not as a guest, but his family. "I would be honored," Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. Emily laughed. "You better be. You started all of this. If you had not walked into that ballroom, I might still be locked in my room, dreaming about escape but never taking the first step." Samuel shook his head, even though she could not see him. "I just showed up," he said. "You did the rest." That is always how it works. Someone opens the door, but you have to walk through it yourself. The wedding was held in a small garden outside the city. The flowers were local, not imported. The champagne was mid-priced and perfectly chilled. The guest list included friends from the shelter, colleagues from the foundation, and a handful of relatives who had proven themselves worthy of trust. Victoria attended, sitting in the back row, her presence quiet and unassuming. She did not ask to be forgiven. She simply wanted to witness her daughter's happiness, to be present for a joy she had almost destroyed. Samuel sat in the front row, next to Harold Jennings and his son, the man whose life Samuel had saved 19 years ago in a desert far away. The son was a father now, with 2 children of his own who called Samuel uncle and begged him for stories about motorcycles and heroism. Samuel told them stories, editing out the hardest parts, emphasizing the moments of courage and kindness that made the darkness worthwhile. When Emily walked down the aisle, she carried a small bouquet of wildflowers, and tucked into the ribbon that bound them together was a compass, old and scratched, with a cracked glass face. She had considered leaving it at home, keeping it safe in a drawer, but Clara had insisted. "Bring it," Clara said. "It is part of your story, and your story is part of this day." The ceremony was brief and beautiful. Vows were exchanged, rings were placed on fingers, kisses were shared, and when the officiant pronounced them married, the small crowd erupted in applause that seemed to echo across the garden and into the sky beyond. At the reception, Samuel found himself standing alone near the edge of the gathering, watching the dancers spin and laugh, watching the newlyweds glow with a happiness that seemed almost too large to contain. He thought about his own wedding, so many years ago, in a small church with folding chairs and flowers from a supermarket. His wife had been beautiful that day, radiant in a dress her mother had sewn by hand. They had danced to a song he could no longer remember, but he remembered the feeling of holding something precious and knowing it would not last forever. She had died of an illness that took her slowly, stealing pieces of her bit by bit over 2 years. Samuel had held her hand at the end, promising that he would not give up, promising that he would find meaning in the time he had left. She had smiled at him with eyes that were already looking somewhere else. "You already have meaning," she whispered. "You just need to remember it." He had spent years trying to remember, years of grief and numbness and the slow, painful work of rebuilding. The shelter had helped. The foundation had helped. The people he met along the way, the hands he held, the stories he heard. They had all reminded him, piece by piece, that his life was not over, that his best chapters might still be ahead. And now, standing in a garden at a wedding he had helped make possible, Samuel finally understood what his wife had meant. Meaning was not something you found. It was something you created, with every choice, every kindness, every moment of courage in the face of fear. Meaning was the sum of all the small decisions that added up to a life well lived. He felt a hand on his arm and turned to find Emily standing beside him. She was radiant in her wedding dress, her eyes bright with happy tears. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." Samuel shook his head. "Thank yourself. You are the one who had the courage to change." Emily smiled. "Maybe. But you reminded me that change was possible. You walked into a room full of people who wanted to tear you down, and you stood tall anyway. That gave me permission to do the same." They embraced, and for a moment, Samuel felt the weight of years lifting from his shoulders. He had carried guilt for so long, guilt for the men he could not save, guilt for the wife he could not heal, guilt for all the ways he had fallen short of the person he wanted to be. But standing here, holding this young woman who had transformed her life with courage and grace, Samuel felt something new, something that felt like peace. The party continued into the night. Music played, laughter echoed, stories were shared around tables lit by candles and string lights. Samuel danced with Clara, who turned out to be an excellent partner despite her claims otherwise. He danced with Harold's grandchildren, spinning them in circles until they shrieked with delight. He even danced with Victoria, a slow waltz that felt like the closing of a circle that had begun a year ago in a ballroom very different from this one. They did not speak during the dance. They did not need to. The movement said everything. A mother and a stranger, connected by a daughter who had refused to remain silent. A woman learning to change, and a man who had already changed. Two people who had started the evening as enemies and ended it as something else. Not friends exactly, but something. When the last song ended and the last guest departed, Samuel walked to his car alone. The night was cool and clear, the stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the letter, the invitation, the decision to show up despite every reason not to. He thought about the people who had shaped him along the way, the brothers who had served beside him, the wife who had loved him, the strangers who had become family. And he thought about the people yet to come, the veterans waiting for housing, the young people searching for purpose, the souls still trapped in cages, waiting for someone to remind them that escape was possible. Samuel started the car and pulled out of the parking lot. The road stretched ahead, winding through darkness toward a destination he could not yet see. But that was okay. He had a compass, not the one he had given away, but something better. The compass in his heart, pointing always toward service, toward kindness, toward the belief that every person deserves dignity, no matter how broken they seem. If you made it this far, it is because this story touched something inside you. It is because you believe, as I do, that courage and kindness are stronger than cruelty and wealth. If that is true, then do me a favor. Leave a comment below saying I watched until the end, so I know you are out there. So I know that this community is real, and that these stories matter to more than just me. Then hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is the time. Because we are building something here. A space where stories of redemption and hope are told without apology. A place where dignity cannot be bought and courage is celebrated. Thank you for watching. Thank you for believing. And remember, it does not matter where you came from or what people think of you. What matters is who you choose to become. Choose kindness, choose courage. Choose to show up, even when the world tells you that you do not belong. Because you do belong. You always have. Samuel Briggs drove through the night, the road unwinding beneath his wheels, the stars burning bright above. He did not know what tomorrow would bring. He did not need to know. He had today. He had purpose. He had the quiet satisfaction of a life lived in service to others. And that was more than enough. The end of the story is not really an end. It is a beginning. For Emily, learning to love herself and build a life on her own terms. For Clara, discovering that courage is contagious and that standing beside someone brave makes you brave too. For Victoria, facing the hard work of change and learning that it is never too late to become the person you should have been all along. And for Samuel Briggs, the poor biker who walked into a rich woman's party and walked out having changed everything without throwing a single punch or raising his voice. He continued his work at the foundation for another decade. He mentored dozens of young veterans, helping them find housing, jobs, and purpose. He spoke at conferences and wrote articles and gave interviews that reached millions of people around the world. But his favorite moments were always the quiet ones. Coffee with Emily on Saturday mornings, dinner with Harold and his family on Sunday evenings, long rides on country roads, the wind in his face, the engine humming beneath him like a heartbeat. He never forgot where he came from. He never forgot the men he served with, the battles he fought, the scars he carried both visible and hidden. And he never forgot the lesson he learned that night at the Whitmore estate. That dignity cannot be bought or sold or taken away. That worth is measured not in dollars, but in deeds. That the quietest person in the room is often the strongest. And that sometimes the best way to defeat cruelty is not to fight it, but to refuse to be diminished by it. Victoria Whitmore died 7 years after the wedding, peacefully in her sleep, in the house where she had spent her whole life. Emily was at her bedside, holding her hand, whispering words of forgiveness that had taken years to find. The estate was sold. The proceeds were donated to the foundation Samuel had built, funding programs for veterans and survivors of difficult family situations. It was the final act of a woman who had spent her last years trying to undo the damage of her first. At the memorial service, Emily asked Samuel to speak. He stood before a small gathering of people who had known Victoria in her final chapter, not her first, and he said something simple and true. We are all capable of change. We are all capable of becoming better than we were. Victoria Whitmore spent most of her life chasing things that did not matter, but in the end, she found what did. She found humility. She found love. She found the courage to admit she was wrong, and that is worth more than all the wealth in the world. The gathered mourners nodded. Some wiped tears from their eyes. And when the service ended, they walked out into the sunlight, each carrying a piece of the story with them. A story about a poor biker and a rich woman. A story about a daughter who refused to be silent. A story about the power of showing up, standing tall, and believing that kindness is stronger than cruelty. Samuel lived for another 15 years after that. He saw Emily become a leader in her field, transforming the lives of hundreds of families. He saw Clara run for local office and win, bringing compassion and common sense to a political landscape that desperately needed both. He saw Harold's grandchildren grow into adults who carried the values of service and sacrifice into a new generation. And when Samuel finally passed, surrounded by the people he loved, he did so with a smile on his face. He had lived a good life. Not a perfect life, but a meaningful one. A life of service and sacrifice, of courage and kindness, of showing up when it mattered most. His funeral was standing room only. Veterans in leather vests lined the streets, their motorcycles forming a procession that stretched for miles. Politicians and social workers and ordinary citizens stood shoulder to shoulder, united by the memory of a man who had touched their lives in ways large and small. Emily spoke at the service. She pulled out the compass, still old and scratched, still pointing true. He gave me this on the night I found my freedom, she said. He told me that as long as I knew which direction I was heading, I could never truly be lost. She paused, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. I have carried this compass for 15 years, and every time I felt lost, I looked at it and remembered his words. I remembered his courage. I remembered that dignity cannot be bought, and that kindness is always the right direction. She placed the compass on his casket. A final gift returned. And as the procession made its way to the cemetery, the sound of motorcycle engines filled the air like a hymn. It was not a sad sound. It was a sound of honor, of brotherhood, of lives lived in service to something greater than themselves. Samuel Briggs was buried beneath a simple headstone. The inscription read, "He showed up. He stood tall. He reminded us that we are all worth saving." And every year, on the anniversary of his death, a group of bikers gathers at his grave. They do not make speeches or hold ceremonies. They simply stand in silence, honoring a man who taught them that strength is not measured in muscle or money, but in the courage to be kind in a world that often rewards cruelty. The story of the poor biker and the rich woman has been told many times since then. It has been shared in videos and articles, in classrooms and support groups, in conversations between strangers who needed to hear that change is possible. It has become a legend, a modern parable about dignity and redemption and the power of showing up. But for those who knew Samuel personally, it will always be more than a legend. It will be a memory, a reminder, a compass pointing toward true north. And that is the end. Or rather, that is the beginning. Because stories like this one do not really end. They continue in the hearts of everyone who hears them. They continue in the choices we make, the kindness we show, the courage we find when we need it most. So remember Samuel Briggs. Remember Emily Whitmore. Remember that no matter how dark the beginning, the ending can still be luminous. And remember that you have the power to write your own story, one choice at a time. Choose kindness, choose courage, choose to show up. The rest will follow.